Welcome to our second video in this module on learning. This is Kristen Lazarova, and in this video, you're going to be learning about classical and operant conditioning. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Ivan Pavlov and how he conditioned dogs to salivate. And this, of course, was, as many of you've read in your chapter, this was identified or recognized sort of serendipitously. It happened by chance because Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist who was studying digestion in dogs, and this was not something that he was looking to understand or find. And that's often what happens in science. So he wasn't looking for this, but he found it, and it led him down a very interesting path that has contributed to our understanding of animal behavior and human behavior today. You're also going to be learning about something called higher order conditioning, which is related to classical conditioning. You'll learn too about associative learning and something called acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. You'll also be learning about operant conditioning. You'll learn about concepts like positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. You'll also learn about primary and secondary reinforcers and different schedules of reinforcement. In other words, how should we provide reinforcement? Should we do it all the time, or should we be doing it every so often? Should we be systematic in how we do it, but still not do it every single time? What's going to lead to maintaining the behavior over the longest period of time?
A very well-known person in psychology is Ivan Pavlov. And Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was studying digestion in dogs. And he sort of serendipitously came across this really interesting phenomenon whereby he noticed that dogs began to salivate to things that didn't naturally cause salivation. So when his laboratory assistant, Pavlov's, would come in to feed the dog that Pavlov was working with, or any dog that Pavlov was working with, what he found was that the dog would start to salivate not just when the dog was getting food, which is a natural, unlearned response to food. So we're going back to natural responses, that digestive process. But the dog was beginning to salivate to the sound of the lab assistant's footsteps, to the sound of the door closing. And so the dog was beginning to associate food with these things in the environment that naturally don't cause a response of salivation. And so what Pavlov became interested in is this association that develops, and he came up with a theory called classical conditioning. And this is where we learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events. So again, Pavlov noticed that dogs salivated not only to the taste of food, but also at the footsteps of the lab assistant's footsteps. And so he also realized that organisms have two types of responses to the environment. They have one that is learned, and this is called conditioned responses, and one that's unlearned or unconditioned. When you all have heard the phrase conditioned, you probably have associated it with the phrase learning. You may have heard people say, I was conditioned to do this, or I was conditioned to do that, or she was conditioned to do such and such. And what they're meaning is they learned to do this. And so Pavlov used the word conditioned. So conditioned means learned, unconditioned means unlearned. And in the most famous example that you read about in your textbook, dogs were conditioned to associate the sound of a bell with food. So when the dogs heard the bell, they anticipated food and they began to salivate. So what they were doing is they were associating the bell with food. The bell became a stimulus in the environment that caused a response that was not natural. This response to a bell, the response of salivation, is not something that dogs are born doing. So they learned this association. This goes back to what we just talked about a moment ago in associative learning. Okay, so here's an image in your textbook in figure 6.4. You see that we have before conditioning, a dog salivates in response to food, very natural. We have the unconditioned response. of salivation. The food is the unconditioned stimulus. And I realize I'm saying this stuff over and over, but I just want to make sure you get it. I think that it can be easy to get confused with these concepts. So the more you can think about this and review it, the easier it will be for you. Remember, the neutral stimulus was the bell. Why? Well, because before conditioning, it had no meaning at all. Just like in the case of the fish for me, or in the case of little Albert, it was the white rat. No real meaning. I mean, I liked fish, little Albert liked the white rat, but it didn't really cause any specific response. Then during conditioning, we have the bell, which is the neutral stimulus, and the food that are paired. And then after conditioning, now we have a conditioned stimulus causing salivation. Now, some of you might wonder about more associations or higher level associations that we can make. And you read about this in your book, where we have an established conditioned stimulus that's paired with a neutral stimulus, a new one. And this we could call a second order stimulus, so that eventually the new stimulus also elicits the conditioned response. So it may be, let's say in this example, here we have an electric can opener, and it has been associated with food, right? And so the can opener is the conditioned stimulus, leading to the response of salivation for the cat. Now, it's not just the can opener that has become associated with food, it's that the squeaky cabinet door has now become associated with food, but it's indirect. See, the squeaky cabinet door doesn't lead to food right away. In this instance, we have probably a squeaky cabinet door that is opened and then a can opener that may be taken out. Let's imagine you don't have it on your counter. You have to take it out to open the cat food. And so the cat hears the squeaky cabinet door and it knows, oh, there's going to be a can opener. I mean, it's not thinking about this in that way, but it's at some rudimentary level, it's making this association. So your cat comes running into the kitchen when it hears the squeaky cabinet door. So that squeaky cabinet door is a higher order or second order stimulus. The cat has learned to associate the cabinet door with the electric can opener and therefore with food. So you can think about how we can develop associations not just with what is associated with that first unconditioned stimulus, but we can develop associations with a conditioned stimulus. So let's think about Watson and little Albert. What if Watson were to, after making little Albert afraid of the white rat, could he pair something with the white rat? Could he pair the sight of let's say, a red light or a green light or something? Could he do that and then that cause fear? So perhaps he does several pairings of the white rat with a red flashing light or a green flashing light. It could be really anything that could be used. Some things where we do develop more, we are more likely to develop associations with than others, but think about that. Pair the red light or a green light with the sight of a rat. Eventually, because Albert is afraid of the rat, he's going to develop a fear of the red light or the green light, whatever thing has become associated with that, because ultimately it leads to the loud noise. Okay, so that's higher order conditioning. So there's the general process in classical conditioning that you read about and learned about in the video review of these concepts. So here we have acquisition, and this is the initial period of learning where an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So what we're doing here is basically reviewing what has happened when we think about acquisition. So this usually requires that there's a very short time interval between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and for the pairing to happen repeatedly multiple times. So what this means is that for little Albert, we need to have repeated pairings of the white rat and the loud noise. We're going to have it over and over again. All right? So 7 times approximately is what it took for little Albert. In addition, it needs to happen close in time. So that white rat needs to be present right at the time that that loud noise is happening. It needs to be very close in time. If, let's say, we had a loud noise and 10 minutes later we have the white rat, the child's not going to make that association. So it needs to happen together. Sometimes conditioning can occur when the interval is set up several hours and the pairing happens only once though. And that would be the case in what we call taste aversion, which is what I described just now when I talked about my aversion or my dislike of fish for some time. It wasn't that I got sick right away when I ate the fish. It was many hours later. I was in college, and it was a Sunday, and I remember very well eating the food at dinner time, and then several hours later I went back to where I went to college, went back to the campus. I was living in a dorm at the time, and I got really sick in the dorm. That's many hours later. And this happens with taste aversion. So I want you to think about why our bodies would be wired in such a way to make these associations, especially with food. So if we didn't make these associations in human history, we would really have problems, wouldn't we? Think about, if we didn't make these associations, we may not have been likely to survive. We may have returned to eat the thing that made us sick. So this is a way of protecting us so that it ensures or at least promotes, I should say, our survival. And so even though the distance in time is great, it makes sense that we would still make these associations. Now you'll notice I didn't associate getting sick with anything else except for eating. And that's interesting, isn't it? So it's as though my brain knows that it's things that I eat that are going to make me sick. I didn't have to really process this and rule things out. I didn't have to say, oh, it was the kitchen light. Oh, it was the sight of the kitchen table. No, I knew it was the food. This is interesting. We take this for granted, but this really tells us about how our brains are wired and how and why we make certain associations and not others. Another important term is extinction. This is a decrease in the conditioned response when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented with the conditioned stimulus. So, do you think that over time, little Albert may have a reduced fear of the white rat? Well, if you Google little Albert, I think you'll find that there's a lot of discussion and wondering about whatever happened to little Albert. I've read that 3 years after this incident of being conditioned, that he still feared not only a white rat, but all things white and furry. So he feared his mom's fur coat. She had a white fur coat, apparently. He feared Santa Claus beards, bunny rabbits, so other furry things. He actually generalized this fear. Now, it would make sense, though, that it would take a while for him to not have this association, because when we develop a fear of things, this is very primitive. This is like a real primitive response in our brain. Go back to what you learned in the earlier chapters about a chapter in the brain. You learned about the amygdala. Do y'all remember that? Maybe not, maybe. Well, that was part of the limbic system. And the amygdala plays an important role in classical conditioning, especially classically conditioned fears. And this is a primitive part of our brain, meaning that it's not something that takes long for us to develop. We're born with this, this well-developed ability to make these associations. And it's primitive also in the sense that in human history, it was present well before other higher level processing was available and present in our brains. And it's also something that we see lower animals relying more on, okay? So fear is a real, that can be hard to, eliminate that association, to extinguish that association. But in the case of Pavlov's dog, I bet we could pretty quickly get rid of that association, where after maybe 10, 15 times, I don't know, it would be interesting to try this, we might find that the dog would no longer salivate to the sound of a person's footsteps if that person stopped feeding them, if there was no longer that association, or the bell would no longer lead to salivation if that bell was no longer paired with food. Okay, it wouldn't take that long to get rid of it. Now, spontaneous recovery. What's interesting here is that you can extinguish a classically conditioned response, but what happens is that when there's a rest from this, when you've stopped making this pairing happen, when you suddenly reintroduce the pairing, the person, the animal will very quickly learn. So wouldn't you imagine that if Pavlov were to condition his dog to salivate to the sound of a bell, and then we remove the bell, maybe 15, 20 times, we remove the pairing of the bell and the food 15 or 20 times, so that the bell is presented with no food, the dog is eventually going to realize, this bell doesn't lead to anything. It's not going to salivate anymore. That when we reintroduce, I should say, the food with the bell, it's going to happen very quickly where we see that bell leading to salivation more quickly than the bell leading to salivation, or the amount of time it took the bell to lead to salivation in the first place. So we wouldn't see that we would need that many pairings between the bell and food. Then this is spontaneous recovery. And so this is where very quickly that animal or person develops this a return of this association. Okay, we also see here something called the curve of acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. And you can see this is figure 6-7 in your textbook. The rising curve is showing the conditioned response quickly getting stronger, okay, through the repeated pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. This is acquisition. And then what we see here is we have extinction. And so the conditioned stimulus is presented by itself. We're not pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus. And then if you'll notice, look how there is that quick drop, so that the person, the animal, they experience a removal of that association, so that the conditioned stimulus is not going to be resulting in a conditioned response at the bottom point of this slope. Then what we see happening is spontaneous recovery. And so this is where we have a pairing of the conditioned the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. And it doesn't take much time at all. It's very quick for now that conditioned stimulus to lead to a conditioned response. I know this sounds very wordy as we're thinking about unconditioned stimulus, conditioned response, unconditioned response. But take some time and really think about these concepts. Apply them to yourselves, and I know that the more you do that, the easier it will be for you to think about what each of these terms mean and what they are. And then, of course, please let me know if you have any questions. I've given you all my cell phone number. You can text me, so if over the weekend you have questions, don't hesitate to do so. I'm happy to help you.
Let's check your learning. A group of ranchers attempted to discourage coyotes from attacking their sheep by placing a substance on the wool of the sheep that makes the coyotes violently ill if they eat it. In this scenario, what is the unconditioned stimulus? Is it the substance that makes the sheep sick? Is it the sickness that the sheep experience? Is it the wool? Is it the ranchers? If you're not sure, rewind this video and go back and take a look at our earlier discussion on classical conditioning, or take a look at your notes. If you selected the substance that makes the sheep sick as the correct answer, you're right. And here's why. The unconditioned stimulus is something that naturally causes a response. And in this case, the substance that naturally makes sheep sick is the unconditioned stimulus, because no learning is required. If learning is required, it's not unconditioned. Unconditioned means natural. It means no learning was required. You might see the phrase unlearned, which also means not learned. I know that's a confusing word if you see that, because it sounds like someone learned something and then they unlearned it, like you did something and you undid it, but you really can't unlearn something. Once you learn it, it's there. You don't unlearn it. It's not just completely gone. You might forget it, but you're not unlearning it. So you need to remember, for purposes of classical conditioning, that unconditioned means natural. No learning was required. Conditioned means that learning was required. So if we said here, what is the conditioned stimulus, we would say the conditioned stimulus is the wool. And the reason it's the wool, if let's say the wool now makes the sheep sick, okay, because we don't want the coyote to continue attacking the sheep. So we want the coyote to stay away from the sheep and to associate sheep and wool with sickness. So if we say now that the sheep or the wool, that's causing sickness, that's going to be a conditioned stimulus because it's learned. That doesn't naturally cause sickness in coyotes, but the substance does. So if you're still a little bit unclear about this, I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at classical conditioning. Make sure you know what each of those elements are. And as you do this, I'd encourage you to think about an original example. Come up with your own. It might be somewhat related to the examples that you've been given, but the more you can make this personally relevant, the better off you're going to be, the more likely you're going to be able to understand it. Let's take a look at another one. Which of the following is true of classical conditioning? So you'll see here that I have some acronyms or abbreviations that I'm using. And so UCS means unconditioned stimulus. UCR means unconditioned response. CR means conditioned response. And CS means conditioned stimulus. So which of these is true of classical conditioning? You might want to pause this for a moment and see if you're able to select the right answer. Again, if you're not sure and you're having trouble with this, please be sure to go back and take a look at your notes or rewind this video. If you selected A, that the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response, you're correct. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to review this with you. And rather than just describing it here as you look at this slide, I'd like for us to look at another slide, and this will take us back to what you learned in the beginning of this video about classical conditioning. So let's take a look. So here's our example that we looked at just a little while ago. So we have a dog that is salivating in response to food. So the food is going to be an unconditioned stimulus. It's naturally causing a response of salivation, right? So no learning is required. This is just a natural part of digestion, and no learning has to happen at all. Okay, so in our previous example, as I gave you that question about the sheep getting sick because of the substance causing sickness, remember that substance is the unconditioned stimulus. No learning was required. So here we have the unconditioned stimulus of food, and then the unconditioned response is salivation. Now, during conditioning, as learning's happening, we pair a neutral stimulus. This is something that prior to conditioning doesn't have any particular meaning. I mean, the dog may have heard a bell before, but it's nothing that's meaningful. It's not been associated yet at this point with food. So during conditioning, we can pair these two together. We can pair the food and the bell. And after doing this a few times, we can remove the food, and then what's the dog going to do when he hears the bell? Well, the dog's going to salivate. So the bell was initially a neutral stimulus, neutral meaning it had no particular meaning at all. And then after that, it became a learned stimulus. It's not natural, it's not unconditioned, it's a learned stimulus, it's a conditioned stimulus because it required learning to happen. So now we have a conditioned stimulus, the bell, that is now causing a conditioned response after learning. If the dog's salivating to it, it's causing a conditioned response of salivation. Okay? So I would encourage you to take a moment to look at this again, maybe to go back in the video. If you're still having some questions about this, you can also look in your textbook. That's helpful too. And I would really encourage you to think about your own examples. Again, the more you can make this personally meaningful, the easier it will be for you to apply these concepts. And most of the questions on your test are going to be application oriented. They're going to require you to think a little bit more deeply. Some of them are going to be straightforward definitions or straightforward examples, just like I gave in that last checking your learning question, but most of them are going to be application questions so that you're really showing that you've learned the material.
So we also have what's called stimulus discrimination and stimulus generalization and habituation. So stimulus discrimination is when an organism responds differently to various stimuli that are similar. So, the dog can discriminate between a specific bell sound. So maybe we have a real low bell tone and a real high bell tone, and the one we've taught the dog to associate with food is the one that's in the middle. And so if the dog is only responding to the one in the middle or things very close to it, we see stimulus discrimination. So in the case of me not liking fish for a while, I didn't have, I actually ended up not liking most fish. So we would say that stimulus discrimination didn't happen. So I wasn't responding differently to other fish. I just thought of fish in general as making me feel sick. So instead, what I experienced was stimulus generalization. And so this is where I didn't like any fish. So in this example, if an individual learns to dislike a specific spider, they'll usually dislike all spiders. You don't like snakes? We had a snake on my deck not too long ago, and I don't care if it was a little snake, a big snake, a black snake, a red snake, yellow, whatever. I don't like snakes. And so for me, there's no discrimination between the type of snake that I might have a fear of and other snakes. And my fear, I'm not really sure where it came from. It did not happen because of classical conditioning. There are other ways we can learn these fears. This is just one way. But oftentimes with things that we fear, we will generalize that. So in the case of little Albert, he generalized the fear. He generalized his response. Think about why. Why would we say that? What else did he fear outside of the white rat? He feared all things white and furry. I also want to point out that classical conditioning can lead to habituation. And what this means is you're learning not to respond to a stimulus that's repeatedly presented without change. We learn to not focus our attention on it. We habituate. It no longer affects our behavior in any new way. And this happens after repeated exposure.
Now that you've learned about classical conditioning, we're going to be exploring operant conditioning. And you're going to be learning about positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. You'll also be learning about primary and secondary reinforcers, schedules of reinforcement. You'll learn about shaping and behavior modification. So let's get started.
So classical conditioning falls underneath an approach of learning that we call behaviorism, or an approach of psychology we call behaviorism. And so it's not just John Watson that we associate with behaviorism, although this is the first time we see this phrase, behaviorism. Classical conditioning is associative learning. Behaviorists emphasize the role of the environment in shaping behavior. So we talked about John Watson and that he used the study of classical conditioning to study human emotion. And we talked about a moment ago how he conducted his famous study on little Albert. And so as a reminder, here we have little Albert who he is exposed to a loud noise, and then we have a pairing of the loud noise with a white rat, and then when he did this, eventually the white rat causes fear. So he became fearful of the stimulus alone. And we can see here it wasn't just a white rat, it was other things as well that he was conditioned to fear. And so he eventually, he began to generalize his fear. So here we see stimulus generalization. Another approach to learning that falls under behaviorism is operant conditioning. And this was a theory that was proposed by Skinner. So we have some famous theorists here. We have Pavlov, we have Watson, and we have Skinner. So Skinner was different from Pavlov and Watson in that he wasn't focusing on classical conditioning. He focused on the consequences of behavior. So he developed this theory, as I mentioned, called operant conditioning, and it's based on something called the law of effect. And this is a very basic concept that you might not have known that it was called the law of effect, but you already know this, that pleasant consequences lead to a behavior being more likely to happen again. Unpleasant consequences lead to a reduction in the behavior. That's the basic law of effect. So when you show up to work, we get paid, right? So we continue to show up to work. Skinner conducted experiments mainly with rats and pigeons to determine how learning occurs through operant conditioning. And he would have pigeons peck on little discs in this like a chamber, and the pigeons learned that if they would poke on these or peck on these different discs, depending upon what Skinner had identified as the pattern or the way that he wanted them to, that they would get rewarded. And so these pigeons developed real complex responses, knowing that if they were to do this, they would get a reward. So we'll be talking about the different types of responses or the different types of what he called schedules that he used to shape their behavior. But let's start out with some basic terminology. Many of us have heard of the phrase positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. You may have been using those correctly, you may not have. So let's clear those up. When we think of positive in the context of operant conditioning, we need to think of adding something. Positive means adding something, just like addition. So 2 plus 2 is 4. You have a positive sign, you're adding 2, okay? So when we think about positive, we're adding something. It has nothing to do with it being good or bad. In the case of negative, we're taking something away, just like subtraction. 3 minus 2, we're removing 2, equaling 1. We're taking something away. We may be taking something away that's good or bad. It has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad. We just need to think about whether or not something is being removed. Reinforcement is where we see an increase in behavior, and punishment is where we see a decrease in behavior. We'll come back to each of these in a moment so you can understand how we put these together. So here is a Skinner box, and Skinner placed animals inside an operant conditioning chamber, as I mentioned a moment ago, containing a lever in the case of rats, and for pigeons they needed to peck. And so in this instance, we see that the rat presses a lever, causing the food to be dispensed as a reward. All right, so let's start with reinforcement. So here we see those two phrases, positive and reinforcement. So if we break these phrases down, this is the most basic, easy one to do. I suppose we have positive, meaning we add something, and reinforcement, we are increasing behavior. So here's the definition. Something is added to increase the likelihood of a behavior. So everyday examples, high grades, paychecks, praise. So let's think about why these are positive reinforcers. If you receive a good grade on a test, you are being positively reinforced so that whatever behavior led to that good grade, you're going to continue. When you get paid, you're being reinforced. Whatever behavior led to that payment, you're going to continue. When you're getting praise, you're being reinforced. You like that. And so you're going to engage in that behavior that led to praise. Here we have a child who's experienced positive reinforcement in the form of a sticker chart. So she's earning a certain number of stickers. Some of you may have had parents who did this with you. If you're parents, you may do this with your kids. And the child is learning that when she does certain things, she gets stickers, and she can trade those in for a trip to the ice cream parlor. In my son's class, they do accelerated reader. They're in 2nd grade, both my sons are. And when they were in 1st grade, they would, after they reached a certain number of points that they earned in what was called accelerated reader, which is a program that you have to read books and then answer comprehension questions about those books. Some of you may know about this. And they had to reach a certain number of points, like a goal. And when they did that, then they got to have a reward, which was a lollipop. And then there was something that they got to do in class that all the kids liked to do, that each kid only got to do when they reached their goal. Now, I thought it was really interesting that my kids were so motivated to get that lollipop, because they could get a lollipop at home, not every day, but it wasn't something that was very unusual. But there was something so special for them about that lollipop that they got in their classroom. And I don't think it was just the lollipop as much as it was also about the praise that they got from their teacher, the internal experience of feeling proud. I think it also had to do with what they also got to do, which was like they had this monkey toy that they got to flip across the classroom. And it was something kind of silly, but all the kids loved doing this. And so there were these real powerful reinforcers for the kids. Now, if the reinforcers weren't powerful or meaningful, the kids might not have been as motivated unless there were other sources of motivation outside of that positive reinforcer. Then we have negative reinforcement, and this is where something is removed to increase the likelihood of behavior. So when you get in your car and you have that beeping sound or whatever sound your car makes whenever you don't have your seatbelt on, you then put your seatbelt on to do what? To remove the beeping sound, right? Or when you have a headache and you take Advil or Tylenol, whatever you take, you have learned that that pill is going to remove the headache. It's negatively reinforcing so that the next time you have a headache, you're going to take a pill. Now, some of you might wonder, well, why is that not positive? Because you're adding a pill. Well, the reason it's not is because it's not the act of taking a pill that is enjoyable. It's the removal of the headache that you experience that leads you to continue taking it. Now, I will tell you, there are some instances where just the act itself of taking something can be positively reinforcing. My kids love to take their vitamins, not because they think that they're healthy and so good for them, but they really like them because they like their gummy vitamins, and I think there's sugar on them, which of course is not the best for them. But for them, that is reinforcing. So when they ask for their vitamin and then they get it, the behavior of asking for the vitamin is increased because they got the vitamin, so that next time they say that, they expect they're going to get the vitamin. So asking that is positively reinforced. In the case of removing a headache, it's not the actual swallowing of Advil that's making you want to take it again. It's the removal of the headache. Think about how drug addiction can be, can result from negative reinforcement. And when I say drug, I don't mean just illicit substances, or those that are illegal, even alcohol. Think about someone who uses a substance to remove something, and what they're removing sometimes are uncomfortable feelings. So it might be they're removing anxiety or some other symptoms of a psychological disorder that hasn't been treated. Oftentimes with drug addiction, what is at its root is not the addiction itself, but there is some untreated psychological disorder like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, just to name a few. So that drug that they're taking, whether it be smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, whatever, or some other substance that they're using, an opiate, that may be negatively reinforcing. It's removing something that they don't like. It can be removing the uncomfortable feelings that they have, and it also can, when it becomes at the point of where it's very addicting, the person is addicted and they develop withdrawal symptoms when they don't have it. It's the removal of those withdrawal symptoms that motivates, that may be part of the reason they're motivated to continue to take that substance. So where you see here that the substance is negatively reinforcing, they're removing the withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so think about your own life where you've been shaped by positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. When you take your test, I'm not likely to ask you to define positive reinforcement or to select the definition, or is the case with negative reinforcement. I'm going to ask you to be able to apply so that you're really showing that deeper learning and understanding.
So you've learned about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Just to reiterate, positive means we're adding something. So in reinforcement, we're increasing behavior by adding something. You're adding something like praise or money. And in negative reinforcement, we are removing something negative. There's like a minus sign or a negative sign, and we remove something and it causes an increase in behavior because it's reinforcing. So I'm removing something that the person doesn't like. I'm removing a headache or I'm removing rain in these two examples that I have here. So make sure that you can think of your own examples of negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, and think about how you would explain why each of these are negative or positive reinforcement. Let's look at punishment. So just like reinforcement, punishment has negative, can be negative, and it can be positive. So positive means that we're adding something, just like with reinforcement. Negative means we're taking something away. So positive punishment means we're adding something and the intent or the outcome is that we have decreased behavior. So something is added and it decreases behavior. This adding could be something like nagging or it could be something like yelling. Now, depending upon the outcome, these two things could also be reinforcing. But let's imagine that a parent is using these and the intent and outcome is that it causes a decrease in behavior. So the parent yells at their child for coming home after curfew. The parent is thinking perhaps that when they yell at them, it's going to result in a reduction in behavior. Not really the best idea to yell at the child. That's probably not the most effective. It might be somewhat effective in the short term, but it's not really conducive to healthy relationships. And there might be other alternatives besides yelling. And the yelling for that person, for that adolescent, let's say, might not even be sufficient enough because the adolescent's thinking, yeah, I came in after curfew. All I had to deal with was my mom or dad yelling at me for 10 minutes, but I got to stay out with my friends. So it might not even be effective in that way. But punishment that is where we're adding something is positive. So we could be adding nagging, adding yelling. You're nagging at someone to get them to do something, or to if you're nagging someone to decrease the likelihood they're going to do something, that's punishment. Okay, so we could also put in here, spanking. I do want to point out that I say this very cautiously when I put this in this box, because spanking is strongly advised against by the American Psychological Association and other professional organizations, and most within the medical field. And the reason it is because it has been associated with increased aggression. It's been associated with increasing anxiety. It also seems to only have a real short-term effect. It doesn't seem to long-term have an effect. Now, it might have a long-term effect on the child's behavior when they're around the parent, but as a parent, you want your child to behave when you're not around. And so are they just avoiding getting spanked, or, and so they're only going to behave when you're around? What are they going to do when you're not around? Also, spanking can, in some instances, be escalated, and it can be abusive for children when it's taken too far. So it really is advised against. There are many alternatives to using spanking. I will say lots of parents have used spanking. Certainly, it does not make a parent a bad parent if they've used spanking. That's something that often, your parents have used it, and so you use it. But it is really, you have to think about the alternatives to spanking. And I would encourage you, if you are a parent, to just think about alternatives and maybe do some reading about spanking and what the potential effects are, and think about other ways that you might be able to shape a child's behavior. There are lots of different alternatives. And certainly no judgment here if that's what you've been doing. I'm just wanting to share this with you because I want to be able to share with you what the research has to say so that you can make the best choices that you can. Let's look at negative punishment. Negative punishment is where you remove something to decrease behavior. So if you think of timeout, you're removing freedom. I think prison is an adult form of timeout, right? And then for children, you might send them to their room, or you might have them sit on the steps away from the family, or in a place in the living room where they're not allowed to play with their siblings. So it can be done in different ways, but timeout is a form of negative punishment because you're removing something that the child likes. And then there's a loss of privileges. So maybe you have an adolescent who breaks curfew, and so you remove their cell phone. You say you're not allowed to have your cell phone for the next week. Or you say to your child, I know for my kids, they really like playing Minecraft. So what I've done that's negatively punishing is I have a chart on our refrigerator that is related to consequences for behaviors that I don't want them to engage in. And the consequences are removing time from video games. So my kids are almost 8, and sometimes they say some mean things to each other. I have twins that are, like I said, almost 8, and they might, call each other names or say something bad to each other. And then they also have a sister who's almost 4, and sometimes they'll say things to her, or they might annoy her on purpose. And I don't want them to do those things. And so I have a consequence for it, and that is that they have a loss of some of their video game time. Now, I'm not going to be extreme and say you can't have video games for a week if they say something that's bad. I know I can't. I think that's a disproportionate consequence for me. And then also I have to ask myself, if I do use a consequence, is it something that I can actually follow through with? You want to make sure you can follow through with it. And it needs to be in proportion to what the person's done. So for my kids, if they say something that, maybe they say something mean to their sibling or they do something, then they get a point on our refrigerator, and the point represents a loss of 20 minutes of video game time. And if they haven't played any games that day, let's say it's a weekend and they are allowed to play video games for a certain amount of time, then that point represents 20 minutes. And that means that their brother can play games while they can't, and they can't get those 20 minutes back. They just lose those 20 minutes. And I've found that by having that on the fridge and they can see it, that there's been a decrease in behavior. Now I have to be careful with this because I find that sometimes they'll walk up to the fridge and try and put a mark next to their brother's name. So I need to, of course, be careful with this. And fortunately, they're not doing it often enough that I would get confused with marks, but I know I'm able to keep track of it. So it's been pretty effective in reducing those behaviors. But I have to remember too that if all I'm doing is punishing and I'm not teaching my kids how to handle that frustration that's leading to saying bad things or annoying their sister, let's say, then I'm really not being a very effective parent. And it's not fair for me to have a consequence like that if they don't know what to do otherwise. So let's say that one of my kids, their brother has aggravated them so much, and then they call him a name. They say something mean. And when they do that, if I have to ask myself, number one, what about the consequence for the other sibling? That's only fair, right? But then I also have to think too, have I given that child the tools to say what they need to, or to handle it in a way that is not, that does not lead to them saying bad things? So what I've encouraged them to do is I say, when you're upset, if you feel like you need to say something mean and you don't know what else to say or how to handle it, please come to me. And when you do, we'll talk about it and I will help you. So each situation's unique. We'll talk about it briefly because I don't want a long time to pass between when that sibling's done something to aggravate them. And then we go back into where their sibling is, maybe in their bedroom or the living room. And then they will say or handle that situation in a way that is much more in line with what's healthy and what's going to be adaptive for them long term. And then I'll reinforce them and I'll tell them they've done a great job, so that what I'm doing is I'm not just punishing. If all you do is punish, you're only telling people what not to do. I think about, for example, I like to shop at IKEA. If any of you've ever been to IKEA or you've gotten furniture there, it's never assembled and you have to assemble it, and it's in like a million pieces. And the instructions are with no words. They're just images of the little pieces and you assemble them. And it can be for big pieces with lots of big pieces of furniture with lots of little pieces. It can be overwhelming. I use this example because imagine, so that's overwhelming when you don't know how to assemble something, but they're still providing you with instructions. What if instructions only told you what not to do? Now that would be even more confusing. We assume that kids know what to do, and we may punish them for what they do that we don't want them to do. But kids don't always know what to do. We're making that assumption because we're seeing it through an adult's eyes. So we need to be sure that we're clear about what to do, and we need to reinforce that behavior. So we don't want to use punishment heavily, number one. And two, when we do, we want to find opportunities to use reinforcement so that the person, the child or adult, knows exactly what they need to be doing so that it's very clear. So let's look at some basic principles behind reinforcement and punishment. So first, use reinforcement much more often than punishment. Think about it. Some of you, when you were growing up, maybe you had a family member who could be a parent, whoever the caregiver was, who used punishment often. Did you really feel like when that person was punishing often, especially if it's really very often, did you feel like you could be very close with that person? Or maybe you feel like you were kind of close to them, but would you have been much closer to them if they didn't use punishment so often? Would you have felt more open to talking with them about your really deepest worries and concerns if they had not used punishment so often? When a parent, teacher, boss, whoever is using punishment a lot of the time and not using much reinforcement, it affects relationships. It affects our likelihood of coming to that person when something does go wrong. And it also isn't really telling that person what we want them to do. We're telling them more often what we don't want them to do. And that doesn't make sense. People need to know what to do. So kids need to know. If you are a student in a classroom, you need to know from your teacher. And if you are an employee, you need to know. And if all you're doing is getting punishment, you're just being told in one way or another what not to do. You also need to minimize the use of punishment. In other words, save it for those times when it really matters. If you're using it so often that it seems to be dominating your days or weeks, you're using it too often. And that also may tell you that it's not working. So if you're not seeing a change in behavior with the punishment that you're using, you need to change the punishment. That does not mean increase it. We need to think about being ethical. We need to think about the rights of the other individual. But ask yourself, is the person doing these things you don't want them to do because of things going on in their environment that could be addressed? So let me go back to my example of my kids. Let's imagine that my son continues to say things to his brother that I don't like. Well, if I keep having a consequence of you get this point and you're going to lose video games and it doesn't seem to work, yes, I could ask myself, is this really an effective consequence? But I could also ask myself, why is he doing this? What's going on that's causing this? Is his brother receiving the consequence that he needs to? Could I, for example, find a way of intervening so that maybe there's no reason for my son to be doing this all the time? Or maybe I notice that there's certain times of day that my son does this. Maybe it's around dinner time. And so maybe his blood sugar is getting low. Maybe he needs a snack. Or maybe I notice that he's doing it around 8 o'clock, and that's when he starts to get tired. So should I make sure that around that time I'm present and I'm not doing other things and that I am there so that if his brother's doing something to aggravate him, I can immediately intervene? Maybe he's just too tired to really handle it in the way that he needs to. You know what it's like when you're tired. You can't think as clearly or have as much self-control when you're tired. So we have to look beyond just, I don't like the behavior and here's the consequence. We need to think about all of the variables that may be contributing to the behavior or maintaining it. I also need to make sure that I'm pairing punishment with reinforcement. So when I'm telling someone what not to do through punishment, I need to make sure that I'm also letting them know what to do with reinforcement, not with nagging words, but I need to make sure that I'm also providing that reinforcement. I'm letting them know through whether it be most likely positive reinforcement. Maybe I'm praising, saying something positive when they do handle the situation in the way that is most desired. I also, if I'm going to use punishment, it needs to be immediate. Some of you, when you were a kid, I know for myself, I remember this. My mom would say, just wait till we get home. And for some of you, when your parents said that, they followed through. Maybe you got in trouble when you got home. And I don't know what kind of trouble you got into. When I was a kid, I wasn't spanked, but I didn't know exactly what that meant when my mom said that, but I knew that I was really afraid. It sounded scary. And so what I would do is I would hope that she would forget. And I might do things to distract her, or I might, when I got home, just say, I'm going over to so and so's house and run to the neighbor's house thinking she'd forget. And she often did. So that was not immediate and definitely was not consistent. So as a kid, let's imagine that I talked back to my mom and sometimes she said there was a consequence, sometimes there was not. There needs to be a consistent consequence. Does it need to be heavy-handed? No. I also need to, as a parent, ask myself, when is this typically happening? What is going on in the environment when this happens? What time of day is this happening? Has my child had a really bad day and maybe I'm a safe target? So that when the child's talking back, it doesn't mean that I just need to say, you can't talk to me this way, here's your consequence. I need to find out what's contributing to this because it may be my child's doing this each day at a certain time, and I might find out that it's something that's going on at school, and maybe I'm the safe target, or if you're the parent, you're the safe target. Kids are often at their worst with their parents because they know you love them no matter what, and so they feel safe to misbehave, to say those things that are you don't want to hear. So we want to think beyond just they did this, here's the consequence. We have to think broader, and that really is using still that behavioral perspective. And then we want to keep in mind that punishment can cause fear and anxiety. So when I was a kid, for example, my dad, I wasn't spanked like I said, but my dad would yell at me, and that really was upsetting. And I can remember being really scared when he would yell. And so I remember that when I was a kid, he would come home a little bit after 5. And I remember every day looking out the window, and I was probably like 10, 11, maybe 12. And I'd look out the window, and if I didn't see him, I felt relief because I was afraid that when he came home, I'd get in trouble for something. So I just think I know that was not my dad's intent. He didn't, there might be things he didn't want me to do. Maybe he was doing that too. He'd had a long day at work, and there are different reasons for why parents do that. But I have to think that he didn't want to me to he didn't want me to avoid him. He didn't want our relationship negatively affected, but that's what happened. So think about yourself. When you had a parent who was doing that, were you likely to go to them? Did you avoid them? Did you feel anxious? Did you feel scared? Do anxiety and fear go together? Absolutely not. So when a child's upset, that's not a time to help them to learn. When you're yelling, that's not going to be the time your child's going to learn. Yelling is not a way to help that child to learn. Actually, we're going to be learning about social learning, and you'll see here in just a bit that this then can be the way that kids learn to handle behaviors that they don't like. So maybe you don't spank the child, but if you're yelling, some people say that that's almost equivalent to a spanking in terms of how it can negatively affect a child. It can cause fear and anxiety. And then also think about punishment leading to avoidance. You might avoid the person, you might be dishonest. And so for kids, you don't want them to be dishonest. You want them to tell you what's happened. You need to be able to help them because, right now, let's say that for some of you, you have young kids, it's not as big of a deal if they're not telling you the truth that they did something. Maybe they hit their brother or something and they're maybe 5 years old. But when they're 16, that matters because when you're not honest, you can't get the help from your parents that you need, and the situations can have much more significant consequences. All right. So make sure you think about these concepts and think about reinforcement, punishment, both negative and positive, and think about these behavioral principles and how they're much more complex than just here's this punisher, here's this reinforcer. We want to really think through what we're doing and why, and think through some of these basic concepts and principles that I've just shared with you. Let's check your learning. So a blank is anything that increases behavior. Is it a punishment, response, reinforcer, or negative punishment? If you're not sure, rewind the video or look back at your notes. If you selected reinforcer, you're right. A punishment decreases behavior. Of course, the answer is not response. A reinforcer increases behavior, whether it's a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer. And negative punishment is very specific in that it is the removal of something and it involves the decrease in behavior. And you know some examples that could include things like timeout. They could also include things like losing privileges. It could be late fees. So now your money's being taken away because you've paid something late. So these are examples of negative punishment. Again, if you're not sure of these, go back and take a look at your notes or rewind the video. All right, let's take a look at this one. Blank involves the removal of something pleasant. Is it positive reinforcement, negative punishment, or positive punishment? Well, first thing you should ask yourself is, are we removing or adding? Well, clearly here in the statement, we're removing. And if we're removing something pleasant, this is going to lead to what? A decrease or an increase in behavior. So let's see what the answer is. If you chose negative punishment, you're correct. Negative because we're removing something, and we're removing something pleasant, which means it's punishing. If you remove something good, something I like, it's not reinforcing. In other words, remember, reinforcement means there's an increase in behavior. And if there's an increase in behavior, it's not because you took away something I like. It's because you took away something I don't like. Remember the examples that were on your previous slides. That could include taking away rain. Now, if you remove rain through an umbrella, that's negatively reinforcing, right? Next time I'm going to use the umbrella because I don't want to get wet. The umbrella removed the rain. You take away a headache by using Advil, for example, that's negatively reinforcing because next time when I have a headache, what am I going to do? Take the same medication. So if you're taking away something I don't like, that's negative reinforcement. If you're taking away something that I like I like to use my cell phone, I like to be able to drive my car, I like to be able to go outside when I want to, I like to have freedom. So these are things that I like. And if you take those things away, it's going to decrease the behavior that led to that. So it's punishment.
We also have a concept called shaping, and this is a tool that's used in operant conditioning. And this is where instead of rewarding only the target behavior, you reward successive approximations of the target behavior. So think about complex behaviors. Let's start with animals. I can remember not long ago seeing a video of a dog that had learned to ride a bike. Now, I seriously doubt that the dog learned to ride a bike just one day and like one day just suddenly got on a bike and knew how to do it. I would imagine that whoever trained the dog had trained the dog using shaping so that they first broke down the small steps that led to bike riding for that dog. And then what they did then is that they would reinforce each approximation towards the desired behavior. And eventually that animal then can engage in complex behaviors. Adults, this is useful in adults as well. Think about when you're shaping, behaviors in children, more complex behaviors. For a very young child, they may not be great at, making a bed. But when you start to reinforce gradually along the way so that eventually the child can do, they can pull the sheets up neatly, they can pull the blankets up neatly, they can pull the bedspread up neatly so it looks nice. You've done this probably through a process of shaping. So how does this happen? First, you reinforce any response that resembles the desired behavior. So in the case of the dog, trying to shape them to ride a bike, you're going to start off by reinforcing any response that resembles the desired behavior. So maybe the dog starts putting its paw on the pedal, like it starts just kind of tapping its paw on it. You reinforce that. And you're going to want to come up with a series of steps, by the way, before you start this. You want to come up with steps that gradually approximate the desired behavior so that, you start with the dog, it's touching the pedal. Then what's the next step that you want the dog to engage in? Maybe it's the dog is climbing onto the bike. Okay, and then there's going to be another step and another step. I won't go through every step. But as that dog is engaging in the desired step, you're going to reinforce it. So you start with the basic one. It's touching the paw. It's touching its paw on the pedal, right? And then you reinforce it. Once it's mastered that behavior, you stop reinforcing it. The dog's going to want to be reinforced. So it's going to try some new things. And as soon as it gets to that next step, an approximation of the desired behavior that you've identified, you're going to reinforce it. Then you're going to keep reinforcing it till the dog has mastered it. Once it's mastered it, pull the reinforcement away, and you're going to see novel behaviors emerge. Then once that dog has gone to the next step that's desired, reinforce that, and so forth. So you see that you're gradually rewarding along the way. There are some great videos on YouTube about shaping, and if you have a dog or a cat, it's not just with dogs, it can be with cats or any animal, you can reinforce them through that process of shaping and get them to engage in behaviors you may not have thought they could ever engage in. We also have some other types of reinforcers. We have what are called primary and secondary reinforcers. So remember, rewards to reinforce behavior can come in many different forms. These are just a few that are listed. But there are rewards that are naturally reinforcing, and there are rewards that are reinforcing because they are linked to those that are naturally reinforcing. So primary reinforcers have innate reinforcing qualities. They're naturally reinforcing. We don't need to learn that these are reinforcing. Okay, so we don't need to learn that food is reinforcing. That's natural for us as human beings. Our brains are wired to like sugary foods and to like foods with fat in them. We don't need, and this makes it hard to not eat unhealthy foods sometimes, but those are naturally reinforcing. Secondary reinforcers are those that have been paired with primary reinforcers. So praise, for example, is a secondary reinforcer because it's linked with affection and love, which is a primary reinforcer. Money is reinforcing because it can be used to buy other things that satisfy the basic needs. It's used to buy, for example, food. So we associate money with those things that are naturally reinforcing. Tokens, we could use a token. And so a token is anything that can be used to return or to turn in for a reward. So again, tokens are things that we can turn in for something of value. So really, money is a token in essence. It's something that every society, not every society, but most societies have. I don't say every because we can think of tribal societies and they may use other things that are not a formal, a formal monetary system. They may use other things to get what they need. They may trade and barter. But let's think about our own system and that we live in what we could call a token economy. In other words, we can trade in these things that are money that represent something of value, and we can then get something of value with them. We can use token economies outside of our traditional monetary system. So let's say that you have a child who they do certain things every day of the week, and then at the end of the week they can trade those things in for something that they value. My sons really want to get Robux, which is something that you can use to buy, upgrade your character and do things on Roblox, which is for those of you who don't know, which probably many of you do, there are many video games that are online through Roblox. So they have to, we kind of came up with an arrangement recently that they have to do certain things each day for a period of so many days, and then they can trade in those points that they get for Robux. So this is a token economy. If you've been to Chuck E. Cheese is a token economy. You aren't not that, and it's not the tokens that you're using, which they don't have anymore. Now they have these cards that you put money on to play games. It's the tickets that you get from winning that you trade in for something of value. You're actually engaging in the behaviors that they want. You're spending your money on their games. And then you are able to, if you win, or if you get so many points, you get to have tickets that you can trade in for things that your kid thinks are valuable. And then we have reinforcement schedules. And so if we want to teach a behavior, we want to use positive reinforcement. Going back to that initial question I asked you at the beginning of our review, reinforcement is the most desired. But there are many ways that you can administer positive reinforcement. We could do it every single time. This is the quickest way to teach a behavior. So every time a dog does, something that you want it to, it sits, it shakes your hand with its paw, you reinforce it, you're using continuous reinforcement. And timing is important. You need to pair the treat with the behavior. You want to do so immediately. So with continuous reinforcement of behaviors in adults, if you're wanting to praise someone, you want to recognize them at work, you want to do that ideally immediately afterwards. It's not always what's going to happen, but it is ideal if it can be immediately. It may not be immediately after every desired behavior, but maybe after a collective amount of desired behaviors, like they've finished a big project and so they're reinforced or recognized. So it's important to note, though, that in this instance, that if we're talking about continuous reinforcement, when you remove that reinforcer, then you're going to see that the behavior will likely stop pretty quickly. So in the case of the dog, you keep giving a treat and then you stop, the dog is eventually, is pretty quickly going to pick up that you're not going to be giving the treat and it's not going to engage in that behavior. So what we might do, because we don't always have reinforcers present, is we might use what's called partial reinforcement, or you might also see it called intermittent reinforcement. And this is where the animal or the person doesn't get reinforced every time they display the desired behavior. They're getting reinforced based on a schedule. And so there are different types of reinforcement schedules. We have fixed versus variable and interval versus ratio. So let's first look at this phrase, fixed. This means that it is predictable. And then we have the phrase variable, which it means it changes, it's variable. And then we have interval, which means that the schedule is based on time. And then we have ratio, which means it's based on the number of responses, performance, what the person or animal does. So now we see that there are 4 different types of partial or intermittent schedules of reinforcement. We have fixed interval, fixed ratio, and variable ratio. So a fixed interval schedule is one that is delivered at predictable time intervals. So patients takes the pain relief medication at set times, every however many hours their doctor prescribes. Now we have the patient taking medication and they are experiencing actually negative reinforcement on a fixed interval schedule. It's predictable, but it's based on time. And then we have variable interval. So this is reinforcement is delivered at unpredictable time intervals. So you have Facebook or Instagram or some sort of social media, and you check that social media periodically, and you see that people like your photo or your posting, or they respond to it. And it's not based on any specific schedule. You don't know that every hour someone's going to respond. It's very unpredictable. And it's not based on anything you do. You don't have control over whether other people like your photo or like your comment. So it's a variable interval schedule. So it's interval because it's tied to time. It's not tied to what you do. And it's variable because it's unpredictable. Then we have what's called fixed ratio. And this is where reinforcement is delivered after a predictable number of responses. So we might have a factory worker who's paid every X number of times an item is made. So let's say that for every 3 times a person assembles a calculator, they're going to get X number of dollars. So it's very predictable, and that person knows that they're always going to get reinforced after 3, not after 2, not after 1, but after 3. And then we have variable ratio, and this is where the person is reinforced after an unpredictable number of responses. So if any of you have ever been to a casino, you could think about going to a slot machine. So I remember going to Las Vegas, and we stayed at a hotel that had a casino on the main floor. And I remember seeing people at the slot machines at all hours, and sometimes people would be at the same slot machine for what seemed like hours and hours. So we might leave the hotel and we see someone at a slot machine, and then we return and the same person is at the same slot machine. Well, the reason is likely because of the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. The person is putting their money into the slot machine, they're pulling the lever, and when they do this, they're anticipating the possibility of a reward. They don't know when they're going to get it. It's very unpredictable. They may think they know. They may have, everyone tries to figure out some sort of method that is helpful in winning money, but I don't know that there is with gambling or with slot machines. Perhaps some of you may know otherwise, but I think that if casinos knew that there was some way, then whoever that person is who's using it might get into some trouble with the casino, but that's a whole other discussion. But we know how addicting gambling is because we keep thinking, if we're pulling that, we put our money in, we pull that lever, we keep thinking to ourselves, maybe it'll be this time. Maybe it'll be this time. So we put money in. Maybe I'm going to get it this time. Oh, no money. Okay, next time. No money. Next time. No money. Next time. Oh, now I got money. And so I get my reward. And so I then feel a compulsion to continue. Maybe I'm going to get it next time. And it might be 8 more times I have to put money in. And then I get rewarded. And then maybe 2. And then I get rewarded. The problem with this schedule for people is that it is very addicting. People don't want to leave that slot machine for fear that the moment they do, someone else is going to put money in and they're going to get reinforced. And this can lead to, this schedule can lead to gambling addiction. And it has an impact on the brain in motivating behavior as people are seeking that feeling of pleasure, that reward that they get, which is a release of dopamine, that reward chemical that they get when they get that reward. So again, interval is based on time, ratio based on what you do, fixed is predictable, variable is not. Think about each of these and how you could relate this to your own experiences, or perhaps just some original examples that you might be able to come up with, and that will help you to think more about this concept of partial reinforcement schedules or scales. You can see here in your textbook, figure 613, we have different schedules of reinforcement, and you can see that these are the different response patterns. So if we look at the one where the cumulative number of responses is highest, that's the variable ratio. So you'll see here the person is getting reinforced, where that line is, that's where the reinforcement is, and their behavior continues. There's not any real drop-off. And it's very unpredictable. You see how you see these lines are there at differing distances from one another because it's unpredictable. And then the purple is the fixed ratio. And here we have a very predictable level of behavior. So we see the behavior increases, it continues, and then the person's reinforced. They might take a little break, a little tiny small space in time where there's a decline. And then we see the behavior is consistent, waiting to the third, for example, in the case of the person getting reinforced for every third thing that they make. They're waiting for that, to complete that third task, get reinforced. We see a little drop off of behavior, maybe a break or something of that nature, but you see it continuing. So you see how this can be very motivating. Here we have a variable interval schedule. And so this is also very motivating. The cumulative number of responses is not as high, but we still see a continued, consistent pattern of responding. And so we here see Facebook, for example. And then we have fixed interval, and we see some dips here where the person is or animal is kind of declining here a little bit, thinking, oh, maybe I'm not going to get that reinforcer. Maybe I'm not going to get it, but I will. I'll be getting it soon. And, it's not as motivating because it's not connected to that person's behavior. They know when it's going to happen, but it's not very connected to their behavior. So we can see a little drop in that here, a little drop in their behavior. So let's now think about the practical application of this. When you think about motivation of behavior, ask yourself, which schedule is the most motivating? Well, clearly it's the variable ratio, right? But in real life, outside of gambling, could we use this? We could probably with, if we're wanting to reinforce behaviors with things like praise or different rewards with adults at work or children in school, or if you're a coach. But let's now imagine a workplace. Could we use a variable ratio schedule for paying someone their what they make for a living? Probably not. People need to have predictability in what they're going to get paid. They need to know that there's an expected paycheck. They need to have some knowledge of this. And so for most people, it would be difficult to work under a variable ratio schedule. And so instead, a fixed ratio might be more ideal. And you could think about in sales, how people use this schedule. Managers might use this schedule with employees, and this can be very motivating in getting them to sell things. Or in producing things. So, you go to the mall, and although now with COVID, I haven't been there in a long time, but I know there are kiosks where people sell lots of different products. And I can remember going through the mall, and some people who work at the kiosks will never approach you. They're not very interested in trying to sell their product. Some are relentless, and they do anything and everything they can. And they might be very effective in their strategies. They try to figure out how can they sell more. So ask yourself, which of those two salespeople is being paid based on a fixed ratio schedule? It's likely the one whose pay is tied to performance. The other one is likely being paid on a fixed interval schedule where their pay is disconnected from performance, so they don't have that incentive to sell. So we can see how performance may vary based on pay schedules. This is not to suggest that we should all be paid based on a fixed ratio schedule. You could think about some more complicated issues. Imagine if teachers in high schools were paid on a fixed ratio schedule. For every student who graduated, they got paid. Well, there's an ethical dilemma here, right? They need to get paid, but they may know that some kids may not be ready to graduate. Maybe they didn't pass what they needed to in 12th grade. So there are some important ethical issues that can be tied to this.
So let's check your learning. Blank requires a random amount of time to elapse before giving the reinforcement. So let's look through each of these. A variable ratio means that it is unpredictable and based upon what the person or animal does. It's based on performance. Variable interval also is unpredictable. It's based on time, has nothing to do with what the person is doing at all. So we have variable ratio, unpredictable based on what you do. And then we have variable interval, unpredictable, just solely based on the passage of time. And then we have fixed ratio. And fixed ratio means it is predictable and it's based on what you do. And then fixed interval means it's predictable, it's fixed, and it's based upon the passage of time. So which of these do you think is the correct answer? If you're still not sure, pause the video and think about it. Perhaps go back to the earlier part of this video where these concepts were covered in more depth. If you selected variable interval, you're correct. And this is number 1 because it is random. Variable means it's unpredictable. If we knew when we were going to get reinforced, if we knew at what time, every 15 minutes we're going to get reinforced, that is not variable, that's fixed. The other thing you'll note is that there are 2 different words. There's ratio and there's interval. And ratio means you have to do something. And interval means it's based on time. So variable ratio would not be the right answer because we say nothing about a person doing anything or animal doing anything. All we see here is there's a random amount of time, so it's variable. And we don't see anything about a person or animal having to do anything, and so we know that it's interval. Now, if this statement said something like, that Samantha is going to receive $3 for every third time that she, and let's imagine that Samantha is your family dog, okay? So Samantha is going to receive a dog treat for every third time that she shakes hands. Well, when you see the word time in there, that does not mean it's based on time. It's based on her shaking hands, right? Or Paul's, I should say, has nothing to do with time. It has everything to do with what the dog is doing. But if I said that Samantha was going to be reinforced with a treat every 15 minutes, now that's time, okay? Or if I were to say Samantha, who is learning how to shake hands, or Paul's, she's learning this, and she's going to be reinforced every so often, and I say nothing about her having to do something to get something, then that is interval, okay? If you're still not clear about this, please be sure to go back in your book and also rewind this video and take a look at these different schedules of reinforcement. Here's another one. Bill began running track and field because it kept him healthy. After winning a few medals, he noticed that his friends looked up to him more and he became more popular. Because the medal is associated with winning and praise from his friends, Bill begins to focus all his attention on winning medals. The medal is an example of a secondary reinforcer, primary reinforcer, fourth reinforcer, or an unconditioned stimulus. If you're not sure, go back and look in your notes or rewind the video. The correct answer is that the medal is a secondary reinforcer. So why wouldn't it be a primary reinforcer? Well, if you'll remember, primary reinforcers are those things that we naturally find reinforcing. So getting attention and admiration from his friends, that's naturally reinforcing. Whereas a medal is not naturally reinforcing. It has come to be associated with the attention and admiration that he's gotten from his friends. So secondary reinforcers are those things that become associated with primary reinforcers. If you're not remembering this, please be sure to go back and look at earlier parts of this video. I'd also encourage you to look at your textbook. There's some great examples in there as well.
You can see here that that there's a very brief description in figure 614 that pathological gamblers use gambling to compensate for abnormally low levels of norepinephrine, which is associated with stress and is secreted in moments of arousal and thrill. There's also research relating it to dopamine, that pleasure chemical that we have released in our brain when we experience something that we like.
So far in this module, the focus has been on behavioral principles. And behavior analysts use behavioral principles to have a positive effect on behaviors in individuals, families, and communities. You've learned about operant conditioning. Think about principles like positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment, primary and secondary reinforcers. Think also about schedules of reinforcement and shaping, behavior modification. we can use these principles to have a positive impact on behavior. And here are some examples. And I would encourage you, as you look at some of these examples, to think about how you might use these principles to change behavior. How might you increase seatbelt use in the community using these principles? How might these principles be used in the treatment of drug abuse or smoking cessation? How might we use these principles to teach people to recycle? How might we use these principles in the treatment of schizophrenia, depression, and other mental illness? What about increasing hand washing behavior of healthcare workers? Or increasing the effectiveness of instruction in regular education classrooms? Or improving college teaching and staff training? Or what about in treating the manifestations of ADHD? Many students are planning on going into a healthcare field, so how might you use these principles to increase medication compliance? Or what about physical therapy compliance? What might you do to use these behaviors to have a positive effect on animal behavior in homes and shelters? We know, for example, that when animals are in shelters, that if they have the behaviors that are desired, like for example, maybe they know how to sit, maybe they roll over, they do these things, perhaps it's going to make them more adoptable. What if we use these principles? I would encourage you, if you're looking for volunteer opportunities, to think about volunteering at an animal shelter, maybe using these behavioral principles to have a positive effect on animals, to make them more adoptable. What could you do to use these principles in helping to treat fears and phobias? As you learned about classical conditioning, think about how phobias might develop through classical conditioning. Could you use these same principles to reduce or eliminate these fears? We'll be looking at that in the later module in this course when we look at the treatment of disorders. So there are many, many applications of these principles to the real world. And I'd encourage you to think about at least one of these and think about how you would use these principles. This will help you to gain a deeper understanding of these concepts and their use. So what have you learned so far? Well, in this last section of the video, you learned about operant conditioning. You learned about reinforcement and punishment, both positive and negative. And you also learned about shaping and primary and secondary reinforcers. You learned about the schedules of reinforcement, and then you learned about how we can use these principles in real-world settings. In this next fairly brief section, we're going to be learning about observational learning or social learning theory, and you're also going to be learning about cognitive learning. So let's get started.
Let's take a look at cognition and latent learning. So we focused on the environment and the stimulus and response. So I'm going to use my pen here again and help you to think about this. So here we have our stimulus, and here we have our response. And so here we have stimulus leading to response. But some of you may have thought to yourselves as you've been reading your chapter, answering questions, and watching the videos on D2L, that there's more to it. There's something in between here. We have choice, right? We don't have to respond to a stimulus. Just because someone praises us doesn't mean that we have to continue that behavior. And not all learning is observable. Not all processing of what's happening is external. We can't see it all. It's a lot of what happens is in our minds. And so an animal, for example, may not always show you that they are learning along the way. We might not see the actual learning until the end product. So the animal might be manipulating things in their mind. It sounds, maybe for some of you, you might think animals manipulating things in their mind, but let's think about, complex tasks. You all have seen your dog, maybe looking out the window and observing something. That animal, your dog, as it's looking out the window, it may be thinking about it's probably thinking about what it's going to be doing. It's not just simply seeing a stimulus and responding. The animal might be planning. They might be having a mental picture of what's happening so that they can then respond in a more complex way than what we might just see with stimulus and response. So here we have cognitive learning and latent learning. And so we have a researcher named Tolman who said that learning could still occur without reinforcement, and that there's a cognitive aspect to learning. So while studying rats, he found that he can put them in a maze to learn their way through it, and they would eventually form a cognitive map of it. So they would learn this layout of the land, and they would do this without reinforcement. So after 10 sessions in a maze without food, food was placed at the exit, and the rats were able to very quickly exit the maze, showing they had learned the way out. So here we have a rat. Clearly, we know that while rats do have some cerebral cortex, like humans do, they don't have nearly as well developed of a brain, but they've developed this cognitive map, this layout of the land. They don't need reinforcement along the way. They can be compelled to learn without reinforcement and then display that after learning has taken place. Then we have latent learning. And latent learning occurs, but it's not observable until there's a reason to demonstrate it. So children may learn behaviors from their parents that they don't demonstrate until they're older. Or it might be that a child learns a behavior and then you don't see it until maybe a week later or 2 weeks later. Maybe you've accidentally used a word you shouldn't in front of your child, or maybe your parents did this and then you hear them repeat it a couple weeks later. Or maybe your child has observed you do something good and you had no idea that they were even noticing or thinking about it. There's this processing happening that we don't see, and then you later see it. I remember when my daughter was, I guess she would have been 2, and she was in childcare at the time, and her teacher had said to me, and my daughter's name is Sophie, that while Sophie was in her school, and she wasn't much beyond 2, that one of her closest friends had come up to her and put a little plastic snake on my daughter Sophia. And Sophia asked her to stop, said, "Stop it." And so her friend did something else, and my daughter walked away and went to another area to play. And then her friend followed her and did something else to aggravate her. And my daughter Sophie then said, "I need to take a break. I'm going to go read a book." When her teacher told me this, I thought, wow, where did she learn that? And then I reflected and thought about myself, that's what I do, and I say out loud when I get frustrated at home, when my kids are not listening to me and they might be, kind of like misbehaving or being wild. I don't want to respond in a way that's automatic. I want to think about how I'm going to respond. I don't want to, be angry in my response. I want to be thoughtful, and I know I need to not be stressed when I respond, to be the best that I can be. So what I do is I say I need a break, I need a timeout, or I'm going to go outside and read a book. So I'll have a book and I'll just go sit on the front steps. And I remember my daughter sitting on the front steps with me when I would do this. And so I didn't know that she was really picking up on this. And this was something I wasn't intentionally doing at all. But what she was doing is she was observing and processing it and then later imitating it. And you can think about how this also can relate to observational learning. Much of what kids do later is a result of what they've observed others doing. And this is part of latent learning. And then we have observational learning, which is related to that. And this is where we learn by watching others. We might imitate what we see right away, or we might imitate it later on. So it might not be evident that we've learned until later, and that's latent learning. And sometimes we show it what we learned right away. And so we have a model, and this is the person performing the imitated behavior. So some examples here, we have yoga students who learn by observation and, with the correct stance and movement. And models don't have to be present for learning to occur. You can watch someone do something on television. We could think about a parent who is maybe struggling with their child's behavior and not knowing how to intervene or what to do. And so perhaps in in family therapy, the therapist may show to the parent some videos on how to respond, or how some different ways to respond, or options that are healthy for both the parent and the child, or perhaps the therapists themselves model that behavior. You could think too about how older siblings can play a role in that. Of course, a lot of times that can be good or not so good. I know my daughter Sophie, she also is learning some things from her 7-year-old brothers. And some of the things that I see her imitate, it's very funny, but it's not necessarily things I want her to be doing or saying. But it's funny because I notice just how much she picks up on from her brothers. This concept or theory of observational learning is based on the work of Albert Bandura, and there have been many researchers since then. But Albert Bandura studied modeling of aggressive and violent behaviors. And what he did is he had children observe adults act aggressively towards a 5-foot-tall BoBo doll. If you'll notice the BoBo doll's shape, you'll see it's like right here. And it's kind of like a Weeble Wobble. If you've ever, when you were kids, you had a Weeble Wobble. They didn't have legs, and you would move the doll at the top and it would wobble around. They'd say Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Well, this was kind of like a giant Weeble Wobble. And so the adult could easily hit the BoBo doll. The adult would hit the BoBo doll, it would come right back up. They'd hit it again, it would come right back up, hit it again. And so the child observed this. And the adult was either punished, praised, or ignored for the behavior. And then the child was given the opportunity to play with the BoBo doll. And if the child had seen the adult punished, they were less likely to act aggressively. We could also call this vicarious punishment. And then if the child saw the adult praised or ignored, they were likely to imitate the behavior. So if they saw the adult praised, this is vicarious reinforcement. Vicarious meaning that they didn't have to experience the reinforcement themselves or the punishment. They could observe someone else experience it, and they could learn from that. Kind of like those of you who are younger siblings, you learn by watching what's happened to your older siblings when they've gotten in trouble, and you realize, oh, I better not do that. You didn't have to experience that yourself.
What did you learn in this last portion of this video? Well, you learned about observational learning, and you learned about Albert Bandura's study using the BoBo doll. You also learned about cognitive learning, and you learned about a cognitive map and latent learning. Please be sure to let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you online.